So, do you really need to do water changes? And the answer is I do a water change about every 2 weeks on this tank, every month to every 2 months on this tank, every 3 months on all these tanks, including this one loaded with stem plants. Water change on this tank probably every 3 months. On this rack, every week I do a water change. On this rack here, same thing. These guys get a water change every single week, with the exception of the bottom rack. These were some of my fry go, and they get a water change every day. Same with rack number 3. Once a week, and last but not least, once a week as well. Hey, welcome back to thedirtytank.com. My name is Andrew, and today we're going to talk about, do you actually need to do water changes? And the short answer is, it depends. But we are going to dive into this topic very in depth and give you my actual thoughts on 7 different categories. First one being goals. What are your goals in fish keeping? Because that's going to have an impact on if you do water changes and how often you do water changes. Also, what type of fish do you keep, right? Some fish are more demanding. Then what type of food, right? And how much do you do your feeding? We're also going to talk about plants and the impact of water changes there. We're also going to talk about filtration, and those are probably the normal ones that you hear. But the other thing we're going to talk about is algae. We're going to talk about how algae plays a role in water changes and why you may want to do more or less water changes depending on how you feel about algae. And then the last one that we're going to talk about, topic 7, I guess, is just my opinion. In general, should you do water changes as a fish keeper or not, right? So let's go ahead and dive into this one. And let's talk about the biggest category first, and that's going to be goals, right? What are your goals as a fish keeper? Now, my goal as a fish keeper has obviously evolved over time. But currently, it's breeding fish. I really enjoy breeding fish. And for those of you who are really into breeding fish, you automatically know you need water changes, and you need a lot of them. And so it's really important to think about your goal, because if your goal is to breed, you will need to do water changes. If your goal is to do less water changes, then you can structure that tank to do much, much less or no water changes, right? It just depends what your goal is. So let's talk about probably a few of the most common goals people have, and if you would need water changes in that particular goal. So let's talk about breeding first. So we already know if you're going to get into breeding, then you are going to want to do a lot of water changes. And so let's think about this for a second and why that is, right? And so if you're breeding fish, right, these fish, right, they have little baby fish. That's what breeding is. And these little baby fish, well, they're just like newborn children, right? They have to be fed 3 to 4 to 5 times a day, right? If for anybody who has ever had a child, a human child, a child of your own, you know that you're gonna have to wake up in the middle of the night a few times during that first couple weeks to feed them, because they get hungry every couple hours, even though all they do is sleep. It's crazy. I don't know how they get so hungry. But it's the same thing with fish, right? Most fish maybe have a yolk sac where you don't have to feed them for the first couple days. But then after that, you're gonna have to feed them for 3 to 5 days, 3 to 5 times a day, every single day for the first week to the first 2 weeks, right? And the reason for this is the survival rate, if they don't eat, right, drops tremendously, right? And let me give you some numbers, right? So when I was first getting into breeding, I was breeding Bolivian rams. They laid about 350 eggs, and out of those, probably about 200 hatched, right? The ones that survived week 1, maybe like 30 of them. The ones that survived week 2, maybe like 10 of them, right? The ones that made it to adulthood, maybe about 8 of them, right? And the biggest reason for this is how much you feed them, and then obviously water changes as well. Because if you're feeding 3 to 5 times per day and you don't do water changes, you're gonna have some nasty water really, really quickly. And so that's why it's very important that if you do wanna breed your fish, then you're gonna have to feed them more. And if you're gonna feed them more waste is gonna be produced. So you're gonna have to do much, much more water changes. And so for me, for my tanks, my fry tanks, I normally try to do a water change every single single day to every other day. Now that isn't all my tanks. That's just my fry tanks, where I want to make sure I'm getting that nasty water out, because I'm feeding them a lot, 3 to 5 times every single day. And so that water can get fouled up pretty easily. Now let's take a look at 2 other goals, right? If you have, I think the other 2 most common goals people have whenever they're setting up a tank is a community low-tech tank and a community high-tech tank. So let's talk about both of those goals. So if you have a low-tech tank, and it's a community tank, right, with friendly fish. Normally you'll have live bears, maybe different types of tetras, maybe some corydoras. Normally you're gonna have much smaller fish and fish that are much more tolerant of nitrates, ammonia, and whatnot. And so for a low-tech tank, I think you can get away without doing water changes for months. And if you want to try your hand out at not doing water changes at all, then I think you can definitely do that in a low-tech community tank. I think it's gonna have to be planted, but we're gonna get into plants and how it plays into if you need water changes or not here in a few minutes. But if you got a low-tech community tank, yes, for sure, you can push off doing the water changes, but there's lots of variables to consider. You know, what is your filtration? What type of fish do you have? Are you understock or overstock, right? How many plants do you have in there? And then specifically, how are those plants grown? Are they completely submersed, or do they have an immersed part to them? Because that plays a big factor in if you'll need water changes, and then also how much and how frequently you should do water changes. And we're gonna hit on that in a moment. All right, so let's talk about the third goal that some fish keepers may have, and that is having a high-tech planted tank. And generally what that looks like means you have a really intense light, right? You have a really powerful light that can grow plants very well. It also means that you have CO2 being injected into your aquarium, and it also means you have some type of fertilizer regimen. Now, if you have a high-tech tank, you probably already know, yeah, I'm gonna have to do water changes every week or every other week at a minimum. And the reason being is you're putting so much nutrients in that tank that if you don't stay on top of water changes, you're gonna have just an absolute catastrophe with algae, and it's gonna destroy all your plants, or it's just not gonna look good if you happen to catch it before it just grows on top of everything. And in addition to that, if you ever look at the back of a fertilizer bottle, right? Some of your liquid fertilizer that you use for your tank, part of the regimen isn't just that you squirt 3 or 1 squirts every single day. It's in addition to that, you also do a 50 to 25% water change at the end of the week, right? So part of the directions of using fertilizers is a water change. And the reason for that is you're putting more minerals and nutrients and even nitrates into your tank by using fertilizer, and the only way to get those things out, right, is to do a water change. And so if you have a high-tech fish tank, then you're gonna have to do water changes. That's just part of it, right? And so we just went over 3 goals, and 2 of them you're gonna have to do water changes, and 1 of them you probably don't. And so right off the bat, you can see why the original response is, it depends. All right, so the next factor that you kind of have to take into account is what type of fish do you have, right? Now, from what I understand and what I believe in the research that I've done is that if you have South American cichlids, then I don't think you should not be doing water changes. If you have South American cichlids, you need to be doing water changes. How often and how much, that's a different story, but at a minimum, you need to be doing water changes, and here's why. South American cichlids are greater, for whatever reason, I don't know why, and the research that I've done doesn't show why either, is because they have a greater disposition to developing hole in head disease, right? So what hole in head disease is, it's kind of like craters or indentions in the head, and along the lateral line of their body. Now, if you don't know what the lateral line is, it's a very sensitive area, normally in the middle of the fish, starting at the head and going down the body. And this is how they can sense different things within the water, right? Whether it's movement or vibrations or other things like that. And it's a very sensitive piece of their, I guess, body and their chemistry. And it helps with balance. It helps with a lot of different things. And so when that gets damaged, normally the damage is unrepairable, right? You can, in some cases, cure whole and head disease, but normally the damage that has been done, it's done, right? And so you normally see whole head disease in Oscars or different types of acaras or crebensis or rams, or Latiacaras, or all the different types of South American cichlids are normally more susceptible to whole and head disease. And the reason for this, what causes whole and head disease, is high bacteria count in the water. And when do you have high bacteria count in the water? Well, when you haven't been doing your water changes, right? And so some fish are gonna need more frequent water changes than other fish, right? And I think one that we know of, that science knows of, is South American cichlids. Now, there could be other types of fish that have a greater likelihood of developing certain diseases if you don't do water changes that we just don't know of yet, right? And so I would say that, one, you want to take into account South American cichlids, but then two, as you're going through your fish keeping journey, and maybe you're not doing water changes as much, and you notice, hey, my neon tetras normally don't last that long whenever I don't do water changes for 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, but the other fish in my tank do. Or maybe it's a type of gourami, or maybe it's a type of whatever type of fish it is. You can kind of make those mental notes and know, okay, if I'm gonna get these fish in the future, I'm gonna have to do more water changes. Or if I don't wanna do as many water changes, then I can't get these specific fish, right? And so you just gotta kind of keep that in mind. Whenever you're deciding, I'm not going to do water changes, or I'm only going to do water changes every so often. Now, the next category is feeding, right? And we kind of hit on this whenever we're talking about goals and we're talking about breeding. But if you feed your fish a lot, then chances are you are going to have to do more water changes, right? That's just the way it works. You're putting more waste into the water, period. Either by uneating food or by they're going to get full and then they're going to poop, right? It's what fish do, especially plecos, right? And so how often do you feed? Do you feed every other day, right? Do you feed once a week? Do you feed every single day, right? And depending on what your answer is will depend on how often you should do water changes, right? In my fry tank, I feed 3 to 5 times a day, so I do water changes every single day on that tank. On all my tanks here, I feed once per day. All my adult fish gets fed every single day. Some tanks I do a weekly water change. Some tanks I do water changes every month or every 3 months. It all depends on the makeup of that tank, but feeding is a variable that you have to consider. Now, another thing that you have to consider that's part of feeding that a lot of people don't realize, you think, well, I only feed twice a week or 3 times a week, so I don't need to do water changes that much. But what if you have your light on for 10 to 12 hours a day, right? What if you have a ton of algae in your tank, right? What a lot of people don't realize is that algae is food, right? But algae is also a plant, so it can help with ammonia, nitrates, and all that. But algae is also food for various types of fish, particularly plecos, right? So you can still produce a good bit of waste by having a lot of algae because you keep your lights on for too long, right? Or because you feed so much that you have a ton of algae. And so you kind of have to think about that, like what role does algae play in my aquarium, right? And think about, do you have fish that will consume that pretty regularly? And do you have enough algae that that's going to impact the waste that it gets put inside your tank? And so there's a lot of different things you have to think of when it comes to food. Now, the last thing we'll talk about in the food topic is what type of food you feed. There is going to be some food that dirty the water a lot more. that when eaten, right, it's a lot of filler and there's just gonna be more waste. There's less nutrients and just more waste in it. And so if you get the cheapest food you can get, then yeah, there's probably a lot more waste in that food, right? If you get more high quality food, there's gonna be less waste, right? And so you can probably get away with certain things. But there are gonna be some foods that are just packed with nutrients and for whatever reason cause more algae and therefore more food for certain fish. Now, one of those foods in my experience is bug bites. My fish love bug bites, but if I feed them bug bites every day, the amount of algae that I get is through the roof, which means I have to start doing a lot more water changes much more frequently. So I don't feed bug bites anymore, and if I do, it's just every so often because my fish love it. It's a great food. It just, I don't want to have to do water changes on some of these other tanks as often, and so I choose not to use it. And what's interesting about this food is this food topic is that there are some food, and they're normally for cichlids, is they have food that is much thinner, right? The flake is much thinner, and it doesn't muck up and cloud the water up as much as maybe goldfish food or tetra food, right? So if you ever look at the cichlid flakes, normally, you can buy the type that is much thinner and doesn't cloud up your water as much. It doesn't lead to as much waste, right? So that's something to take into account. Now, the next thing that and you probably have heard this a lot, but I think you haven't heard the way I'm gonna talk about it. So let's talk about plants, right? If you have a lot of plants in your tank, then yes, you probably don't have to do water changes as often. But let's talk about what type of plants, right? Because it's not just any plants. You can't just have, a million cryptocorin and expect that to solve your nitrate ammonia issue, right? Because cryptocorin is a really slow grower. It's a slow growing plant, much like Anubias or Java fern or most types of moss. So not only do you gotta have a lot of plants, but you also have to have the right type of plants. And in my opinion, the right type of plants that you gotta have if you wanna do less to no water changes are plants that have a immersed component to it. Now, immerse means growing out of water. And so if you have a jam-packed aquarium with a bazillion plants, but none of those plants are coming out of the water, then I don't think that is as beneficial as you think it is, right? And let's pretend you're not injecting with CO2. Let's talk about a low-tech planted tank. If you got a ton of plants in there and you're not injecting CO2, then its growth capacity and its nutrient absorbing ability is limited by CO2, right? But once that plant gets outside of the water column, it now has access to more CO2 and therefore is able to absorb much more nutrients. And so which plant should you have in your tank if you're looking to do less water changes to no water changes? Any type of plant that can grow fast enough and tall enough to get to the top of the water and then keep growing a little bit. And they can have that immersed part of the plant without it drying out and dying, right? And so most of your stem plants can work like that. A lot of plants are actually not, a lot of our aquarium plants aren't truly aquatic, right? They're actually in that transitional phase where they can go either one direction or the other. And so stem plants that come out of the water column are gonna help floating plants, duckweed, dwarf water lettuce, Sylvania minima, red root floater, frogbit, all of those are great at lowering ammonia nitrate. And the reason being is that their roots are in the water column, absorbing what's in the water, but they also have exposure to more CO2 than some of the plants that are just submersed. Now, our next topic is filtration. So how does filtration impact if you should do water changes or not? Obviously, if you have more filtration, you're gonna not have to do water changes as often. But it's not just about how many gallons per hour can this filter move or what is this filter rated for. But in addition to that, it's also what type of filter media do you have inside your filter, right? Because let's think of it this way. You can have an external canister filter that's rated for a 125 gallon tank, right? And it can do its filtering thing on a 125 gallon tank, and it can filter wonderfully. You can have another 125 gallon tank, and you can have 3 sponge filters in it, and they'll work almost the same. You're not going to get the clarity in the water, in the air filters, the sponge filters, like you would with the canister filters, just because there's more flow. But as far as housing beneficial bacteria, it's all about what is inside your filter, right? And so if you do get a canister filter, or a hang-on back filter, or a sponge filter, you want to make sure that the surface area that it has, that there's a lot of it, right? And so if we look at any of my filters, I have ceramic biorings, I have lava rock, I have coarse filter sponges in there. None of the cartridges, none of the replaceable ones, none of that, because they hold so little beneficial bacteria that you're kind of lowering the capacity that your filter can filter by just not adding the right type of filter media. And so filter media that I would recommend are coarse sponges. I'm going to link them down in the description, and also ceramic biorings. They're so porous that even something this big, a sponge this big, is actually the size of like almost a house, right? Because it's not just the outside, it's every layer within side of it as well, each way. And so there's just so much room when you have something more porous like that, that also has a larger surface area for them to grow on. And I do know that there are filterless tanks, and I even have some, that some people never do water changes on, right? And I think there are ways to do that, but that's a topic for another video. All right, so next let's talk about algae, right? Now, I don't really hear this topic talked a lot in regards to water changes, but algae is a plant, right? And it's gonna do what plants do, right? They're gonna photosynthesize, and they're gonna help pull some of those nutrients out of the water column so that they can grow, right? So it's gonna help lower nitrates, ammonia, all of that. But what I see happening is that there is some algae that affects plants more than other algae do, right? And so let's think about your blackbeard algae, and also your cyanobacteria, or your blue-green algae, right? And what happens is, over time, as you don't do water changes, assuming you're not, the amount of nitrates in your water is slowly going to increase. And if you have plants, they're going to consume that. But over time, what will happen is some of these algae, specifically blackbeard and cyanobacteria, is going to start growing on your plants. And what happens when it grows on your plants is it's going to kill your plants if you don't do something about it. And then once your plants are dead, then there's nothing else competing with algae, and it will start to then take over everything in your tank because it has more nutrients to do so, because your plants are dying off. And then what happens is you have a very ugly tank. Now, does this mean that you need to do a water change at this moment? No, because those algae are now acting like plants and are kind of keeping those nutrients at bay. But it isn't a very appealing to the eye, and it's also expensive, right? If you drop $200 to get a ton of plants in your tank, and then you just let algae cover all of them, and then you let algae slowly kill everything, and then you let algae just take over, it's not going to look very good, and you probably will fall out of love with the hobby. And so I think people got to think about algae, right? Yes, some algae is good, but in my opinion, too much algae is not good at all, period, right? Especially when you get hair algae, it's hard for fish to swim in that. They can get trapped in that, and they can hurt themselves, right? And then cyanobacteria is actually toxic if the fish eat it. Now, fish instinctively know not to eat cyanobacteria, but if they do eat it, right, that could be an issue. And in addition to that, some of these algae smell, right? Most algae don't, but cyanobacteria, there's been reports that it smells bad, right? We don't want that in our house. And so you got to think about your relationship with algae, right? There's some people out there who have fish rooms, they're like, yeah, ton of algae, but a certain type of algae, and I'm okay with it. And if you allow that algae to grow, you know, there's like that green dust algae that grows on your side of your tank, but doesn't really cause anything within the middle of the water column. Yeah, that may be all right for like shrimp tanks, breeding tanks, and whatnot, or even your display tanks if you're okay with that level of algae. It isn't necessarily going to be detrimental to your fish, but you're going to want to think about your relationship with algae, because certain type of algae aren't really good for the reasons why we got into fish keeping to begin with. Now, after we took all of that into account, I'm in the camp of, yes, I am going to need to do water changes. I don't have a scenario where I don't do water changes. Now, is it possible for you and your circumstances to have a tank where you don't do water changes? Yes, absolutely. But if you're going to do so, in my opinion, I think you got to keep in mind what type of fish you have. You got to keep in mind what your goals are, and you got to make sure that you have some type of plant that has an immersed growth component to it. And I think if you have all of those things, then yeah, you can have a tank without filtration, and maybe even without doing any water changes. But for me, I'm gonna do water changes just because what my goals are for these tanks forces me to do so, and I like doing them as well. I can connect with my fish every other week or every month or every 3 months, depending on when I do water changes for that month. I hope this helped you out. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. I'll be sure to get to them. And let me know how often you do water changes and what your setup looks like. Leave that down in the comments so we can all learn from it. And I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks.